He stared at the shattered remnants of his dream. Every single attempt had failed. But somewhere in the broken pieces, he knew something valuable was waiting to be found. The doors kept closing, one after another. He had lost everything he worked for until, in his deepest moment of despair, a thought flickered. Maybe I'm not done yet. David Chen stood in his empty restaurant at 2 a.m., the foreclosure notice still clutched in his trembling hands. 3 years of 18-hour days of pouring his life savings into this dream, of believing he could make it work, all of it crumbling around him like the peeling paint on the walls. The dining room that had once buzzed with laughter and conversation now felt like a tomb. Empty tables stared back at him accusingly, each one a reminder of the customers who never came, the reviews that never improved, the staff he'd had to let go one by one until it was just him, alone with his failures. "What's wrong with me?" he whispered to the darkness. "Why can't I get this right?" This wasn't his first failure. The food truck had failed 2 years earlier when he couldn't handle the permit complications. The catering business had collapsed when a major client canceled at the last minute, leaving him with massive debt. Now this, his dream restaurant, his final shot at proving he could make it in the culinary world, was joining the graveyard of his broken ambitions. He slumped into one of the chairs, his chef's coat still stained with the sweat and tears of another brutal day. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator that would be repossessed next week. But as David sat there in the ruins of his dream, something shifted. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, he found himself analyzing. Really analyzing for the first time. The food truck had failed because he'd focused only on the cooking, ignoring the business side. The catering company had collapsed because he'd put all his eggs in one client's basket. And this restaurant had failed because he'd been so obsessed with creating the perfect menu that he'd forgotten to create an experience people actually wanted. "Failure isn't the end," he said aloud, his voice growing stronger. "It's a lesson in disguise. It's not the fall that matters, it's the strength you find to get up again." Over the next few weeks, as he cleaned out the restaurant and settled his debts, David did something different. Instead of hiding from his failures, he studied them. He talked to former customers, analyzed his competitors, and most importantly, he listened to the criticism he'd previously dismissed. The patterns became clear. He was a talented chef, but he'd been cooking for himself, not for his customers. He'd been so focused on impressing food critics that he'd forgotten to serve food that regular people could afford and enjoy. Every failure is just a lesson wrapped in disguise, he realized one morning as he read through customer reviews with fresh eyes. 6 months later, David found himself standing outside a small food stall in the local farmer's market. It wasn't glamorous, just a simple setup with a few burners and a prep table. But this time he'd learned from his mistakes. Instead of an elaborate menu, he offered just 3 dishes, perfected through months of testing with friends and neighbors. Instead of exotic ingredients that sounded impressive, he used fresh, local produce that tasted incredible and kept costs reasonable. Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, he focused on being the best at what he did. The first customer approached, a skeptical-looking woman with 2 young kids in tow. "What's good?" she asked, eyeing his simple setup with doubt. David smiled, remembering all the times he tried to oversell his complicated dishes. "I'm not afraid of failing again," he thought to himself. "I'm afraid of not learning from it. Try the Korean barbecue bowl," he said simply. "My grandmother's recipe, but made with ingredients from the farm right over there. If you don't love it, I'll refund your money and throw in a free drink." The woman hesitated, then ordered 3 bowls. David cooked with the confidence of someone who had finally learned to listen, to his customers, to his failures, and to himself. The first bite told the story. The woman's eyes widened, and her kids stopped fidgeting to focus on their food. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the aroma and the sight of people actually enjoying their meals. By noon, David had sold out completely. As he cleaned his station that evening, counting the day's earnings, modest but honest money, he thought about the empty restaurant that had nearly broken him. That failure had taught him more in 6 months than culinary school had in 2 years. The greatest strength isn't in avoiding failure, he told his girlfriend that night as they celebrated his first profitable day in years. It's in turning it into something that propels you forward. The food stall grew into 2 stalls, then a small catering operation focused on simple, delicious food for working families and local events. David never did open another restaurant, but he built something better, a sustainable business that fed his community and his soul. 3 years later, as he watched a line of customers enjoying lunch at his expanded market stand, David pulled out his phone and looked at a photo of that empty restaurant. Instead of pain, he felt gratitude. "Don't fear falling," he said to a young chef who'd approached him for advice. "Fear never getting up again. Because here's what I learned: you don't fail because you fall. You fail because you choose not to rise." The young chef nodded, scribbling notes, but David could see the skepticism in his eyes, the same skepticism he'd once carried. "Failure is the stepping stone to wisdom," David continued, gesturing to the bustling market around them. "Every mistake, every closed door, every moment when you wanted to quit, they're all teachers in disguise. The hardest lessons come from the toughest battles. And I wouldn't trade that wisdom for anything." As the afternoon crowd began to gather, David tied his apron and fired up the burners. He'd learned that success wasn't about avoiding failure, it was about transforming failure into fuel for something better. And that made all the difference.